For me, it's incredibly personal. During the war in Kosovo, I was a young mother, forced to leave our home, fleeing with my baby daughter in my arms. We were cold, starving, terrified, trying to stay ahead of the violence that was sweeping through our homes and our towns. One of the only sources of information we had was the Voice of America. We carried a small battery-operated radio, holding it up to the sky with the antenna pointing out, straining to hear any news from the outside world. The radio was our lifeline until the battery died. We were completely cut off, but the horror was all around us. One of the massacres we would later learn was about Rachak, where 45 unarmed Albanian civilians, men, boys, and elderly were executed. It was a tragedy that captured the world's attention because Ambassador Walker was there to witness it. And he had the courage to call it what it was, a crime against humanity. But tragically, it was far from the only one. I must mention a few. In Maya, more than 370 people, mostly men and boys, were separated from their families and executed. I was less than a mile away when it happened. I didn't know what was unfolding at that moment, but I felt the fear, the tension, the silence that followed. It could have been us. In Kosovo, 243 civilians were murdered, many of them women and children, some burned alive. In Anita, 147 men were executed or being rounded up in the field. And in Kosovo, the town I called home, more than 1,000 civilians were murdered. I would later return on the back of a tractor trailer, passing by melted, destroyed homes and burned bodies, still unaware of the full horror that had taken place just steps from where I had once lived. And let's not forget, over 20,000 women and men were raped, used as weapons of war. And I wrote one of their work from one of their survivors today. All this just because we were Albanian ethnicity. These numbers are not just statistics. They were the lives of mothers, fathers, sons, and daughters, my relatives, my classmates, and my family members, taken without mercy just because we are Albanian ethnicity. For a long time, the world was silent. But in Rachak, Ambassador Walker broke that silence. His voice gave weight to our suffering. His courage helped bring international awareness and eventually intervention. Years later, I made it to Fredericksburg. The city became my sanctuary. I rebuilt my life here, opened a small business, and raised my daughter in freedom. Paying it forward is my obligation. It is how I honor those who didn't survive. It is how I say thank you for the freedom, the safety, not going to bed hungry, and the second chance I was given. Today Today, Kosovo and Fredericksburg are forever connected, not just through my journey, but through our shared belief in truth, justice, peace, and the power of one voice to make a difference. To Albanian people of Kosovo, Ambassador Walker is our hero. And to all of us today, he is a member that's standing up for what's right and changed the course of history. It is my deepest honor to welcome the man whose voice carried across oceans and borders, even reaching another, hiding in the mountains with a dying radio. Welcome, Ambassador Walker.
I also want to start by just pointing out two people in the room besides Anita, who is so responsible for this afternoon's event. Already mentioned is Sabigashi, who's back there someplace. Where is Sabi? There he is. Sabi is my right hand in Rockville, where I live, and has been very responsible in helping me get the book out. Thank you, Sabi.
You're welcome.
I do like to start with something a little less serious than what the rest of my talk will be about. When I first went to Kosovo after the war with my then wife, who passed away 10 years ago, my wife, who was from Brazil, she kept hearing the word over and over and over again as we passed from one crowd to another. And finally she came to me and asked me, although she knew I spoke practically no Albanian, she said, I keep hearing this word grua. What is grua? What is this word grua in Albanian? So I had to ask someone, and they said, grua, that means your wife. So they're pointing out to people your wife. Even I, with my limited Spanish, I know what the word grua means in Spanish. Grua, which means in Albanian wife, in Spanish means tow truck. So I want to introduce my tow truck. Okay, I can be a little more serious, but I do want to say at first, this is the first time, I believe, in the last 25 years when I've gone to a good number of Albanian diaspora meetings celebrating Flag Day, celebrating Independence Day in Kosovo, all these different days that mean a lot to Albanians, especially in the diaspora where they're now living in the United States mostly and celebrating their freedom and liberation here in the United States. But I can't remember a single one of those meetings, some of which have been huge, in New York City, for instance, in Chicago, and other places. I don't think I have ever been in a room where there are so many, what I call gringos, people who are American citizens and have really nothing to do historically or from their family with the Albanian cause, the Albanian nations, the various parts of the Albanian diaspora. So to come to Fredericksburg, which I have always thought of as a historic Virginia city, you know, great history during the Civil War and that sort of thing, to come here and find a community of Albanians, Kosovo Albanians for the most part, but Albanians sitting next to, next to each other with families from the American diaspora who happen to live in Fredericksburg. I just find that inspirational, I really do. And so I express my appreciation to the city of Fredericksburg, to the mayor, the former mayor, and obviously to Anita for bringing the two groups together. Let me just ask, if I could, how many here are Albanians? Oh my God. And how many are Kosovo Albanians?
We all Kosovo.
Are there Albanians from other parts of the... Albanians from Albania? Any from Montenegro? No, okay. As I say, I'm really overwhelmed to hear that in the high schools, my God, I don't think there's another high school in the United States. I'm not sure in Kosovo there's as much history taught about what happened during the war and what happened, what caused it, why did it end, and about this new nation that we're all proud to call the Republic of Kosovo. Let me just give you a little bit of the flavor of what I did in Kosovo. I really want to explain. I'm not a hero. I really am not a hero. What happened at Račak, as was vividly described by Anita, was not the first, nor was it the last. There were massacres before, much bigger. There were massacres after. There was the incredible oppression and putting down of the 95% of the population of Kosovo that were Albanian. Ethnicity was Albanian. The government in Belgrade, and I really want to emphasize, when I talk about Serbia, I'm talking about the government in Belgrade, not the Serbian people. The Serbian people, especially the ones in Kosovo, you know, they suffered just as badly from being ruled by a dictatorship, a cruel dictatorship in Belgrade. Slobodan Milosevic, the cabinet, the minister of information, propaganda, who is now the president of Serbia, and is still putting out the story that Račak was a fake, that Račak was a lie, that Walker was employed by the CIA to go there and do this. I'm delighted to find a fellow ambassador here this afternoon. And she would know that we go out as ambassadors. We don't go out as representatives of Langley, of the CIA, nor of the Defense Department. We go out to tell the State Department, and through the State Department to tell the U.S. government what is happening. What are the people going through in that particular country? And I know you've been in some of the tough ones, so you also had to tell what you felt was the truth of the situation. So I went to Kosovo. I was born in New Jersey. I'm sorry if there are any Jerseyites here today. I'm kind of ashamed of it, but I grew up in California, the beaches of Southern California. I went to UCLA, I went to USC. I joined the Foreign Service without knowing what I was getting into. I had no knowledge of what the diplomatic service was all about. I ended up spending 40 years there before retirement. And I can't say I enjoyed every day, but I was proud of those 40 years. I was proud of representing the United States of America in places where there was little in the way of democracy, there was little in the way of human rights observation. I served the first 35 years of my career mostly in Latin America, either in Washington or in Brazil, Argentina, Peru, Bolivia, Honduras, and most dramatically in El Salvador. And in all of those places, I don't know if it was coincidence or what, but they were run by military governments, oppressive governments, non-democratic governments. My most notable experience before going to El Salvador, prepared me for civil wars or things happening that were considered dangerous for the embassy, but I never felt threatened. In El Salvador was a little different. I was there for 7 years, 4 of which I was the ambassador, and some things happened during that 4 years that was an all-out civil war. 2 violently opposed groups, the government, the military government, the oligarchs of the country versus the rest of the people of the country. Now I'm going to sit down because my back is getting a little funny. So I went to El Salvador, and I spent 4 years there, and I witnessed a lot of horrible things. But there was something that was very similar to the Rajak massacre. I witnessed in November of '89 an event that actually helped end the war, but at the time was a horrendous event. The guerrillas, the FMLN, started a final offensive in the war to show that they were still strong, they were still there, even though the Soviet Union had fallen, Cuba had ceased its assistance. They wanted to show they were still there fighting, and they launched an all-out offensive around the country, including against the residence I was in. And in the second night of the offensive, a very horrible thing happened. A unit of men got onto the National Catholic University, pulled out 6 Jesuit priests, including the rector, men that I knew. They were what were called liberation theologists. They were not involved in politics, but someone thought they were a problem and came in and slaughtered them. And I didn't get out to that site for about 24 hours, and it was horrible. Here were 6 priests and their housekeeper and her daughter lying in front of me. The problem was we didn't know right away what had happened, and as a result of which, for a month and a half until we kind of solved the case, I was telling the world we didn't know what happened. We did not have the evidence to tell you what happened. Everyone assumed it was the military, it was the military, but no one had the evidence to prove it. So I, as the American ambassador, saying we don't know yet, we'll tell you when we know, I was accused of covering up for the killers of the Jesuits. A few years later, in 1997, Madeleine Albright, the Secretary of State, called me in one day and said she wanted to send me to Bosnia. That the human rights situation in Bosnia was horrible. There had been a terrible event called Srebrenica, in which not a dozen or 2 dozen or 100 or many more were killed. And the United Nations was there and essentially did nothing. So she wanted me to go and be the #2 in the international organization that was involved in Bosnia. At the last moment she told me I wasn't going to Bosnia, I was going to another trouble spot in the Balkans. She asked me if I would go to Vukovar. And I said, Madam Secretary, I don't know what we're talking about. What is Vukovar? And I was told that that is the capital of eastern Croatia, where the Serbs and the Croats have had a war, killing each other, human rights violations on both sides, but it's kind of been pacified by a United Nations peacekeeping operation, and they wanted me to head it up. And I said, why would I go to the Balkans? I've never been there. I don't know the history. I don't know Croat from Serb from Mongol. I know nothing about the Balkans. And she said, yes, but your colleagues who served in London and Paris and Rome, you know, they've never had a shot fired over their heads. You've been in war zones, you might feel more comfortable than some of your colleagues. So I went to Vukovar. I spent 6 months there. I closed the mission. It was considered one of the United Nations' most successful peacekeeping mission. And I left when we were supposed to leave in January of '98. I came home. I was happy with what I had experienced. It was interesting. The history of the Balkans is incredible if you go into it. And sure enough, in October of '98, Madeleine Albright called me in again. This time she said, we just announced, Ambassador Dick Holbrooke, one of our honorary secretaries of state, has just announced that the OSCE is going to put a peacekeeping operation into Kosovo, and we want you to go there because there is actual war going on. There's the KLA on one side, there's Serb security forces on the other. And I accepted. I had no idea what it was going to be like, but I took it. When I arrived, we were looking to set up a verification force of maybe up to 2,000, maybe more, internationals from the countries of Europe, members of the OSCE. We never were able to get more than 1,200 in because Belgrade played games with us, they wouldn't issue visas, they delayed all sorts of things. But very quickly in October, November of '89, we put together, as I say, up to 1,200 verifiers, as we called them, and started spreading them out around Kosovo. One of the instructions that I got as the head of the mission by Vienna, one of the instructions I passed on to the verifiers as they arrived was, we are here neutral. We are not taking sides. You know, there is an equivalence between the two sides, and we're going to be in the center of that. That lasted about a week. It was very clear, very quickly, that there was something wrong in this community of 95% Albanians who were denied all the benefits of citizenship in Serbia, and the 5% who were sort of the masters of the scene. Not to mention that they were getting instructions from Belgrade. Not to mention there was an army of thousands of soldiers, another army of thousands of police who were enforcing Belgrade's instructions in terms of the 95% Albanians. As we spread out across Kosovo, and the volunteers lived in the other cities, we spread them out to the cities, and then we started to spread our volunteers out to the villages. And those were the people, those were my volunteers, who really saw what was happening. Villages being burned to the ground, mosques being destroyed. As we said, as Anita said, you know, abuse of all sorts taking place from the Serb military and police. So I have yet to meet, I met one, but I have yet to meet other members of the KVM who did not agree with everything I said at Racak and everything I've said subsequent to Racak. Our volunteers who lived in villages and lived with families, almost always with Albanian families, because that's who were out in the villages, you know, they came away seeing what those families have been dealt with, how they have been dealt with. So I have no doubts as to our lack of keeping up with the neutrality, keeping up with an equivalence of who was responsible for the human rights violations in Kosovo. So that's, you know, if anyone were to buy the book and to read it, you know, it's a light read. It's mostly anecdotes about my youth in Santa Monica, California, how I got into the Foreign Service, but the stuff about Kosovo, which is 2/3 of the book, you will read about the actual scene in Racak. But what I want to say is, you know, how did it come about that there had been many massacres before, more violent, and there were massacres afterwards? And yet Racak, this small village where 45 villagers were killed, men and boys. The government at first told us and described to the world that what had happened was a battle between the KLA and the army and the police, in which all the victims, all those who had died, were on the KLA side, and there had been no casualties on the side of the government. That in itself was a little fishy. The day of the 15th, I was in Montenegro trying to get them to allow us to open a KVM office there. And because of conflict between the Prime Minister of Montenegro, essentially a Serb, and the government of Milosevic, they were political rivals. And so I had a very nice day in Montenegro, and they agreed we could open an office there, just to stick their thumb in the nose of Mr. Milosevic. So I flew back to Kosovo that night in a helicopter, and when I landed, I was told by my British deputy, a general, our liaison with the Serbian military, that there had been a battle between the KLA and blah, blah, blah. 15 had been killed. They were all in uniform. They all had heavy weapons, etc. And that was at about 10 o'clock at night. I went home, I went to bed. It had been a busy day. I came in first thing in the morning, and my deputy said, "Pastor, there's something fishy with this story about a battle. We had verifiers out there the night before, watching as the police and the military moved into Rajak after bombarding the village for most of the day. There was no battle. There was no battle going on in Rajak during the day. There was bombardment by artillery from the, at the end of the bombardment, the police and the military moved down, and the next thing we knew was a number of the villagers were being carried off. And this is important. In the aftermath, when Belgrade sort of changed their story about it being a KLA battle, they still tried to maintain that these were people who were fighting against the police and against the army. And my reaction, my response to that was, look, even if they were KLA fighters and you captured them in the middle of a battle, you disarmed them, you marched them off unarmed under the protection of your soldiers, and a few hours later they turned up dead. That is a war crime in and of itself, even if they were KLA. Anyway, hearing this from my deputy, we decided to go there and see for ourselves. So we got out to Kosovo, to Rajak maybe, I don't know, 10 hours, 12 hours after they had been killed. It was a very bitter Balkan winter. The ground, which out in the countryside is rocky and dirty and full of debris, and we had to go up a hill outside of the village. The earth was full of ice and snow, and I could barely keep my balance as we walked up this ravine. And so to think that the night before, 10 hours before, this had happened, these bodies that we encountered had somehow been tampered with, which is what the government claimed after the idiocy of their explanation was issued. When they first said it was a battle, that these guys were in uniform, none of the bodies were in uniform. All of the bodies were in the clothes of campesinos, as we say in Latin. They were in peasant clothes. The bullet holes in their clothes were all very consistent with them being shot there. The blood was right where the bullet holes had gone in. It was obvious that they had died where we found them. It was obviously they had been killed from gunshots coming down from above. So the government was caught unawares. In previous massacres, the massacre had occurred, the international community or anyone got there late, and they had time to arrange the crime scene. Our getting there within just a matter of hours, they had no time to do anything to change the crime scene. So they kept having to come up with ridiculous stories explaining what had really happened and that Walker was a liar. The more the stories got wild, stories that I and my verifiers had gone up there in the middle of darkness, in the middle of the horrible conditions of winter in the Balkans, amid this ice and snow, and we had somehow changed the uniforms into peasant clothes and somehow arranged the bullet holes to coincide with where they'd been shot, was so ridiculous then they moved to, well, it was much better organized. It was the CIA, and then Walker was an agent of the CIA. And the more Milosevic came out with these stories, the more the present President Vučić came out with these stories, the more ridiculous it became. And the more journalists came from around the world. The other massacres earlier, sure, a couple of journalists would come up, they'd send the story back to their home newspaper or TV station, and it would come out, 2 days later it would be old news. The story of Radchak was on the front pages of Wall Street Journal, New York Times, Washington Post, the big story, the big newspapers around the world for weeks. And that would not have happened if the story of my team getting there and saying this is what we thought it was and challenging the government to prove otherwise by allowing an independent investigation. So journalists came in, who's the big CNN guy? Wolf Blitzer, people like that came in from around the world. And they would have only been there a couple of days, except Milosevic continued to make stupid mistakes. In the first instance, his anger at what I had said, they declared me persona non grata and tried to tell me to leave the country within 48 hours. The international community, thank God, even the Russians, went to Milosevic and said, you can't do that. But that generated another series of stories in the newspapers of the world. Shortly thereafter, there was a conference in London looking at Radchak. Shortly thereafter, there was a conference called Rambouillet in Paris, in which they tried to make for a peace agreement between the two sides. After several weeks of negotiations, the Kosovo Albanians agreed to sign, even though it was to their detriment to sign. And at the last minute, Milosevic refused to sign, which again generated news around the world that Milosevic was saying blah, blah, blah to the international community. I maintain to this day that if Milosevic had signed at Rambouillet, which was very favorable to the Serbs, today we would still be talking about Kosovo as a province of Serbia. But the man was so ready to say, I'm going to tell the world what happened, and if they don't believe me, tough. This is what I say happened, and you all have to believe me. Thank God there were other things happening. So I'll tell you one of the other reasons that Radchak generated the sort of story that went out and the reaction to it by the international community. At the time that we're talking about, mid-January 1999, the leaders of the free world and the leader of Russia all had their own problems. Bill Clinton was involved with something called impeachment over what was her name? Monica Lewinsky. So that was his story in the press, and he was very interested in, diverting attention from the press to something else. Tony Blair in London, another popular leader, was nevertheless having problems in his party with various issues of domestic politics. Jacques Chirac in Paris, similarly, domestic politics wanted him to divert attention. Germany, Schroeder had just come in as chancellor. He had just come into office, and there were all sorts of stories about whether Germany was still going to send its troops overseas, or was they going to confine themselves to German issues. It was all the leaders of the free world, including Yeltsin in Moscow, had problems. And they all, I don't want to say were delighted, but here was an issue they could get into seriously and show the world they were interested in promoting human rights and democracy in Europe. And so they all came together first in London and then in Rambouillet, the foreign ministers of all those countries, and pushed very hard for a settlement. Pushed very hard on the Kosovo Albanians, who, as I say, agreed to sign, pushed very hard on Milosevic, and in the end he just said, go away, international community. And for that collection of sort of events, Milosevic's stupidity, the absurdity of their description of what had happened, the fact that we got there right away and were able to see the scene before it was dabbled with, and then the international community, for once, they did not get together over Srebrenica in Bosnia. They did not get together over what happened in Croatia. But that one event on the papers, front page of the papers of the world, resulted in something quite different. Okay, that's all I want to say about Bračak. What I do want to say something else about is Kosovo. The Republic of Kosovo, and I use Kosova, which I understand is the Serb way of describing the country. Kosovo is the Serb way of doing it, or the international community, because that's the way they've heard it for many years. In the Balkans, the difference between the last letter in a word can mean the difference between opponents. And you got to be careful when you talk to someone, if you don't know what ethnicity they're from, you got to be careful what the last letter of the word Kosovo is. I call it Kosova. I just want to say one thing about it. I am incredibly proud. I've been going back to Kosovo every day on Independence Day celebration, every year on January 15th, 16th, when they have a ceremony. 15,000 people go to this village. There is now a beautiful monument to the Bračak massacre in Bračak. So I've been going back ever since ever since liberation, and especially since independence. I was there in the parliament when they declared independence, one of the proudest moments of my career. And I'm even prouder every time I go back now, because in my opinion, this small country in the heart of the Balkans, one of the most conflicted areas in the world for the last thousands of years, is today a gem. It is a jewel. Albanians, Kosovars, whether they be Albanian or Gypsies or even Serbs, should be very, very proud of this small nation that in a mere 15 years since declaring independence has shown exactly what Kosovars can do if given the chance to do what they want to do, which is make Kosovo a better place, a democratic place. If you put down a list of everything that I hold, and I think our Constitution holds as being the rights, the Declaration of Independence, the freedoms of free speech, journalists being able to say whatever they want, freedom of speech, all the freedoms that I know of, that I have spent 40 years of my life telling the world about. I'm not sure if my colleagues in today's American embassies are still telling the world about those things, but I was extremely proud of them. And Kosovo today, in my opinion, and in the opinion of others like me who have gotten to know Kosovo, Kosovo is the most democratic country in the Europe, if not in the world. A number of countries in the EU that since independence have withheld recognition from Kosovo, saying you don't do enough for the minorities, you're not doing blah, 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 are themselves much less democratic than Kosovo is. Kosovo is fulfilling all of the principles of democracy and holding to them. The system of justice works. No one is above the law. Everything is there. And yet, very few people, except in Fredericksburg, outside of Kosovo know this story. And that is one of the reasons I'm so pleased to hear what Anita, what others are saying, what the mayor of Fredericksburg is saying, what all of you, I think, represent in terms of being here today. I tell Kosovars, I tell Albanians from the other homelands, you have to be very, very proud of what Albanians have accomplished in Kosovo, and it's happening elsewhere in the diaspora, in the homelands. But I believe Kosovo can be a example, the light at the end of the tunnel, or whatever they say, for the rest of the Balkans, and that the Balkans can become a much more peaceful place than it was when I first went there in 1998. So I hope not only Anita, but more importantly, those in the crowd who are not Albanians, any chance you get in the classrooms, for instance, to tell the world what a very interesting experiment is going on in Kosovo, and what can be done by a people if given the chance to show their best. I said that up until recently about El Salvador, because I was there under military governments, I was there under oppressive regimes, and they had, after the war, a period of progress toward reconciliation, etc. And again, El Salvador has sort of fallen into a bit of a depression, thanks in part to Americans' intervention. What many Americans do not know, and I've got to tell you, I'm from California, I hate to tell you, but not the Venezuelan gang, but the MS-13, which is on everybody's front page today, the El Salvadoran gangs, were invented in Los Angeles, my hometown. And for various stupid reasons, we sent young men back to El Salvador, and they went back without Spanish, without knowing much about democracy, and they fell into gangs. And today, 30 years, 40 years later, we've got the problems with El Salvador. What I'm saying is, you give a Salvadoran the chance to do something right, and by God, they're going to succeed. You give a Kosovo Albanian, or Albanians of any sort, the chance to have a restaurant, to do whatever, and by God, they make a success of it. So, I am delighted to meet all of you. I hope to see all of you. I hope some of you will buy the book so I can sign my name to attest to that. And I cannot tell you how much I appreciate Fredericksburg, and those of you who are from Manassas, who I just met someone. To me, I truly believe in diversity. I also believe in people coming together despite or in favor of diversity. So I'm really proud to be here, and I hope to come back soon. Okay, thank you very much. Because again, giving a person a chance to do something, the women came into the Foreign Service, immediately showed what they could do. The same is true in Kosovo. When I went to Kosovo, in my first visits around the villages, I would see a room full of people like this, but all the men were here and the women were way back there, ready to cook the meal or make the hors d'oeuvres for the gang. The women of Kosovo are now leapfrogging ahead of the men. I am very involved, or was involved, as the chancellor of the university there, at American University we opened, the best university in the Balkans as far as I'm concerned. We now have over 50% of women students, and they're going off around the world in Kosovo, doing fantastic things. So to meet a colleague, a former colleague, and see her, as she just said, in Fredericksburg, gathering with this group is just, for me, I greatly appreciate it. So thank you very much.
Yes. So, during your career, you kind of have been in hard places, and faced a lot of challenges, and a lot of your career, a lot of your people, the same position from different countries, they would go and do the job, but at the end of the day, they would go home and they would kind of like, conclude that. But you made your mission. So my question is, what made you make this your life mission, to stand up for what is right, to make your life mission, not only when you went home to continue to work for justice, but also after you retired and many years, you put so much effort, so much energy, and talking, even at this age, to come and speak to us and young people to talk about doing the right thing, no matter when it's hard, no matter if you are tired, no matter what nationality, you always stand for truth. So what made you do that?
During my career, I think it's in the book, I say that wherever I went and saw these situations where I was supposed to believe there was an equivalence between right and left, and rich and poor, I kind of felt that those who governed owed something to those they governed, which was to provide a life as best as they could provide to those they governed. That those who were in power did not give to themselves more advantages than those that they were governed. So it's in the book, in a paragraph or two. After retirement, I came back. Let me put it this way. I hope my pastor doesn't doubt what I'm saying. I came back in the year 2000, expecting to be asked something about what had happened in Kosovo, because it was a big issue. And what I had done, there were some people who thought it was good, some people thought I had acted not very diplomatically. You're supposed to call for an investigation. We don't know who was guilty or who did what. But since I returned 25 years ago, not one person from the State Department has asked me about what happened in Kosovo, what I thought had happened, why did I do what I did. Not once. Not once. I've only been back to the State Department a few times. As should be expected, I went, they searched me. For the first 10 years, I still had a diplomatic passport. Anyway. So I haven't had much to do in terms of official diplomatic corps of the United States. I still tell young people it's a great career. I never regretted for a minute my 40 years in the diplomatic service. I enjoyed every day of it. I cannot think of anything I would have rather done. I'm not sure today I would recommend to a young person to join the Foreign Service. I don't think it's the same as what I had or what I think you had. I don't know when you left the Foreign Service. I don't know what the circumstances. Now, what have I done since then? Why have I continued on with coming to meetings like this and promoting the Albanian cause? No one has offered me a job. I went ambassador to Kosovo. He left the service and immediately went to work for Bechtel, which had just built a multi-billion-dollar highway through Kosovo at excessive expense. And he left after propagating that project for Bechtel, and he went to work for them. I've had no such experience. No one has come and asked me to do it. Anyway, that's fine for me. I've grown old. I've seen some grandchildren appear. I've lost my wife and met a young lady from El Salvador who was ready to be my grua. And I'm happy. Every time I go to Kosovo, my injuries, or whatever you call it, my old age sort of disappears, and I feel young again. They put up a statue to me that's 3 meters tall. It's much nicer than the one they put up to Bill Clinton. I object to that. I don't know if you agree with me, Pastor, but people have asked me who was most helpful to you in Washington and in the international community for what I did in Kosovo after Rajak. It was Madeleine Albright. She was a really strong and effective Secretary of State. So,
She's my first.
Pardon?
She was my first secretary.
Oh, I should know, Candy. Now I know when you came in. Okay, thanks again for being here.